I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of More Than Kurosawa. And this week, we are going to be looking at the film Cure by director Kiyoshi Kurosawa. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is pick a different Asian movie to cover by a different Asian director and try to help us understand the wide world of Asian cinema by highlighting an awesome movie by an awesome director to help you explore and learn more about Asian cinema, which is why the series is, of course, called More Than Kurosawa. But this week, we're going to be looking at a director who is more than Kurosawa, that is Akira Kurosawa. The man still has the same last name, this week covering Kiyoshi Kurosawa. And how we've been structuring these videos is the first half just briefly talking about why I picked the director, why we're going to be covering his movies today, and then also to recommend a couple others aside from the movie we're covering in the episode. And then the second half of the video talking about the movie itself and why I picked that. The way I've sort of been doing these videos is I think if you haven't heard of this director or if you haven't seen any of their movies, it's a great place to start and to learn more about them. There's usually a good starting point movie that I recommend and I talk about on this show, while also being one of their best. So feel free to check out the films of Kiyoshi Kurosawa. But jumping into the discussion of the filmmaker and kind of why I wanted to choose Kurosawa is because of his most recent influence on the state of the most celebrated Asian movies of the past few years. He's done a lot of work. I guess you would consider him a master of horror in many ways. I think particularly in the West, he's most known for some of his more scarier movies. Pulse, Cure, even a movie like Creepy. That's where he kind of made his bread and butter. But he's done plenty of different genres since the 90s, working in drama or sci-fi or a lot of thriller comedy kind of. So he has done a lot of different films, very prolific filmmaker. So he is very varied in that sense. But I still think a lot of people know him as that kind of master of horror. But when you look at modern Asian cinema, you really see his influence. Just last year, Koji Yakusho was the actor in Perfect Days, which is the Wim Wenders movie that was celebrated. So if you were a fan of the Oscars, you knew that that was contending for Best International Feature Film. It was Japan's selection. Well, Koji Yakusho has collaborated many times here with Kiyoshi Kurosawa, and probably his signature collaborator, at least in terms of an actor. So, if you maybe saw Perfect Days and you want to check out more of his movies, definitely check out Kurosawa. There's a direct connection there. And then even a couple of years ago, Drive My Car, which was written and directed by Ryusuke Hamaguchi, Ryusuke Hamaguchi is a student of Kiyoshi Kurosawa. He learned under him. He actually wrote one of Kurosawa's most recent movies, Wife of a Spy. So when we look at kind of the modern day Asian cinema, at least for the past couple of years, at least in terms of the Oscars, Drive My Car, Best Director, Best Picture winner, brand new exciting young filmmaker, even someone like Koji Yakusho, who maybe you haven't seen a lot of his movies, but he's a huge star in Japan. You want to check out more of his movies. All that kind of ties back to Kiyoshi Kurosawa. And he's not as popular as someone like Akira Kurosawa. He is, despite having the same name, kind of, I think, still a little bit under the radar to a lot of film fans, despite them maybe knowing some of the more modern Japanese films like Drive My Car or Perfect Days. But speaking about the man himself, I touched upon it earlier, but I think he's most known for being that master of horror. And I think the reason why he's so associated with that genre is because his stylistic attributes are so well suited to that genre. That is, he is a master of the slow-moving, heavy camera. Think of Kubrick in The Shining. Think of John Carpenter with Halloween. Think of even David Robert Mitchell's It Follows, where you have an almost omniscient camera. That is to say, it's not from the character's perspective, but almost like this floating camera, this godlike perspective, where it knows what's going to happen without the characters necessarily knowing. So we'll have long takes of shots where someone maybe will enter the frame and then exit the frame, and then we're still lingering on the shot, and then that adds that sense of dread and that sense of horror. So that kind of omniscient, slow-moving, ominous camera, I think he uses to excellent effect. And that's his stylistic sense. He doesn't use a lot of close-ups. It's a lot of kind of wides, a lot of still shots, but still kind of slowly moving or panning. And that style, I think, works best in the horror genre because it creates a sense of dread or a sense of anxiety. Now, he also uses it in some of his other movies, like, I mentioned Life of a Spy. In terms of some of the tension of that movie, it works very well, that slow-moving camera. But it works best when there is kind of this almost ominous, hard-to-understand dread of an evil lurking behind somewhere, or of a serial killer, of an unknowing evil force. It works really well, which is why a movie like It Follows kind of uses it to great effect, for example, because it has a similar theme. And what I love so much about international horror movies in particular is because you lack context. You don't necessarily know the certain rituals or superstitions of an area. You also don't know many of the actors. When you're watching a Hollywood movie, if the person who is in the front of the poster, that's a big star, they're probably going to make it to the end of the movie. They're probably not going to be killed. And the guy you've never heard of, he's probably going to get killed off first, because that's just, kind of your insight, and you can't avoid that because you know certain actors, you know how big or popular they are. So sometimes it can kill some of the suspense. But with international horror, it really does add a sense of true horror, which is why I think even Korean horror movies have done very well in the past 10 years or so. I think in part because of that element, but even going back to this kind of period of Kiyoshi Kurosawa with movies like Cure and Pulse, but then if you combine that with The Ring and the kind of J-horror scene that was happening during this time, he's very influential to that moment. But also I think it works so well because you really don't know who's going to get kind of caught next, which is what I think makes the genre so interesting. But what makes him such an expert at that genre is his ability to rely on his slow-moving camera to build dread, to not have a lot of quick editing. This is not a Conjuring-esque kind of jump scare type movies. They're slow, they're deliberate, and they're eerie. I mean, he made a movie called Creepy. You could say a lot of his movies have that kind of creepiness, but that tone, that atmosphere, he's much more interested than showing you, an instant jump scare. And he really does have a sharp sense of tone throughout all his movies. Even when you bring it to something like Tokyo Sonata, which is more of a family drama, but it feels kind of awkward and horrific in a different kind of a way because of his ability to kind of linger in that uncomfortable. And I've talked about in other videos comparisons of the directors we're covering to other Western or Hollywood directors. And this one was maybe a little more of a tough one. I guess you can compare him to someone like a Stanley Kubrick, because I think of that slow-moving camera in the same way Kubrick does with The Shining or Eyes Wide Shut, or has a kind of hypnotic feel to some of Kurosawa's films in the same way you could say a movie like 2001 has a very hypnotic feeling too. They are different, but and I'll also think about sometimes how they can. Kubrick is a master of kind of every genre while still keeping his style. In the same way, Kurosawa, maybe not a master of every genre, but has done a lot of genres and still kind of keeps that style. I just think Kurosawa's, is more of an expert in horror than he is in sometimes other genres, and his techniques work best within kind of intense drama or thrilling movies like Life of a Spy or horror. But he's really just a fascinating filmmaker because of that ability to control the atmosphere and the tone and the style of his movies. They're very distinctive, they're very engaging, very hypnotic, very dreadful. And I think he's an expert of horror, but really an expert in dread and something bad's about to happen, and that omniscience through his techniques that makes him just a really interesting filmmaker to cover. And he's got many great movies too. So whether you check out Tokyo Sonata or Life of a Spy or Cure in this case, or Creepy, I watched a bunch of them in anticipation for this video and was really impressed by many of them. So it was tough to pick them, the one I did. But transitioning now over into the movie I did pick, which is Cure, just talking a little bit about the film. If you don't know, it's about a detective who is investigating a series of murders that don't necessarily look like murders, they look like strange suicides. And then quickly within the movie, we are introduced to the killer, and we start to see his kind of hypnosis and his ability to convince these people to kind of kill themselves. And the detective is trying to make sure that he doesn't fall underneath the hypnotist and the serial killer spell himself. And this is a perfect match between script and story and plot idea and director. It's about a movie of a man who is hypnotizing people into killing themselves. And Kurosawa, through his technique, is great at kind of building that hypnosis. He is, like I mentioned before, that slow-moving camera, that slow rhythmic pacing, really does a great job at building that dread. So you have this kind of unknowing force of this evil guy who's convincing people to kill themselves through this kind of inexplicable force, I guess you would call it. So that it's not, jump scares, like I mentioned. It's not super gory. A lot of the kind of visceralness, I think, of the movie is just how clumsy and messy a lot of the killings are. We're almost always in the wide. We almost always see it directly. He's not a guy who's going to cut away before the person shoots themselves or what have you. You see it directly. But because we're further back and we're in a wide, it's removed, it's cold. Most recently, if you think of, how Scorsese filmed the killings in Killers of the Flower Moon, that kind of sense of removedness and that messiness, Kurosawa does a great job with that here too, in the kind of almost sadness, I guess, of the whole situation. And so it's just a perfect, marriage of a story about an unknowing force that has this sense of dread and inevitability, combined with Kurosawa's kind of omniscient camera and perfect sense of dread and tone and atmosphere. Just works so well with a great Koji Yakusho performance. It's just a super entertaining kind of detective movie that's also horrific, so it's very easy to recommend. But what I really like it, and what I think elevates it beyond just a really kind of engaging horror movie, is that I do find it hypnotic. And that should be a red flag for all of you. Because when someone says a movie's hypnotic, it can sometimes mean code for boring. Because if you don't connect with the hypnosis, if you don't fall underneath the film's spell, then you'll find it boring. There's plenty of movies. We mentioned Kubrick, like 2001: A Space Odyssey. A lot of people consider that movie hypnotic, strange power that it has on them. For me, it doesn't have that power on it. I've seen the movie many times. I've never been able to connect with it. I don't love it. So it's hypnotic to some people. To me, it's boring. But then also I see movies like this, or I see movies like Jonathan Glazer's Under the Skin, starring Scarlett Johansson back in 2013. And I thought that movie was a very hypnotic movie, and I did fall underneath that movie spell. And it did, pun intended, get under my skin. But what I really want to kind of explore here just for a brief second is what that means when a movie is hypnotic. Because sometimes, like I said, it can just mean code for boring or slow. But what I think Kurosawa is great here is using the hypnosis of his camera and his visual style to marry really perfectly the storytelling. This is a movie about a killer who kind of hypnotizes his victims and puts them under a spell so that they kill themselves, so that they lose their mind and kill themselves. And how does the killer do that? He does it with this very kind of slow, deadpanned, quiet tone of voice. He does it by telling you to focus on something as he's speaking, guiding your senses to, listen to a rhythmic kind of a pace of his voice while also looking at an object, traditional kind of hypnosis that you've, I'm sure seen before in other pop culture. So that's what the killer's doing. But then what's the filmmaker doing? The filmmaker's doing the exact same thing. Kurosawa is hijacking our senses. He's telling you what to look at with the framing. He's giving you what you should be hearing. In this case, oftentimes those scenes, the kind of rhythmic pace of the dialogue, the rhythmic pace of the editing, so that it becomes an almost hypnosis of a movie. So it's a perfect marriage because we understand why the serial killer is so effective, because Kurosawa is kind of mirroring the techniques that the killer is doing. So as a result, we kind of understand and empathize with the characters and go, oh yeah, right, I'd probably fall for it too. I'm not, some genius guy. I probably would, look at the water and get hypnotized or kind of fall under their spell, because Kurosawa is a great filmmaker in helping us kind of understand why this is such a dreadful kind of and horrific idea. Because it's so simple. It is not super scary. It's something realistic, but it's also this force that we can't understand. And that combined with that omniscient camera, this kind of inevitable evil that you can't stop. And it really does kind of get underneath your skin and help you think about it for days, because it's not a cheap gag that happens right away. It's something that builds through the editing, through the rhythmic editing, through the slow moving camera, and through the kind of hijacking of the senses that Kurosawa does. So it's an excellent kind of entertaining detective movie, but in the same way Zodiac is a great detective movie because we become obsessed with the case. This is a great detective movie because we kind of understand the power of the serial killer. So that when the detective is kind of having issues catching the serial killer because he's starting to fall underneath his spell, you understand it because you too are falling underneath the film's spell. So it really does linger with you. It really does allow you to think about the movie for days, not because of its complex political themes, but because of that hypnotic appeal that the movie has. I know for a lot of us, hypnotic movies are really hard to connect to. For me, that's a prime example. Sometimes to me that means boring. But I think because it has that through line of this is a detective trying to solve a murder case, that's enough to kind of keep you engaged. It's an interesting, entertaining horror detective story. But what makes it special is the kind of correlation and that mastery of Kurosawa mastering the hypnosis that the killer is doing in the movie, so that we feel like we are kind of losing our minds too. It's a great kind of a directorial film because of those flourishes that he adds, and a perfect example that when it comes to Asian cinema, there is more than Kurosawa. Akira Kurosawa, that is. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know if you've seen this film, if you've seen some of other Kurosawa's movies. Maybe you'll check it out now that you know that a guy like Ryusuke Hamaguchi, it was a student of his. So if you like Drive My Car, maybe you can check out some of other Kurosawa's movies. Or if you like Perfect Days, maybe you'll check out some other Koji Yakusho movies. That would mean a lot to me, just to help you understand the great wide world of Asian cinema and how many great movies and great directors that maybe you haven't heard of are out there. From the 60s, the 50s to the 90s, we've been covering a lot of them, so I hope you've been enjoying these videos. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video, and until next time, stay tuned.